Hello and welcome to Breaking Down, the series where we analyse a Fire Emblem unit from a gameplay perspective. Today we will be taking a look at the School of Sorcery attendee, Mercedes. Before we start, I would like to thank the people who support me in making content like this by backing the channel on Patreon, where for just £1 a month you can get access to a bunch of benefits. For more info, check the link in the description. Whilst this series is not focused around plot, there is always a chance for spoilers, and certain elements of the game and its structure and story will inevitably be mentioned, so if that is a concern for you, feel free to give it a miss. Also, where relevant, this is considering the maddening difficulty on a regular new game file with no exploits or excessive grinding. Mercedes is a member of the Blue Lions, so if you were to choose them as your starting house, she will be available from Chapter 1. Otherwise, she will need to be recruited if you want to make use of her in the Black Eagles or Golden Deer. Like with most students, this can be done by reaching a B support with Byleth, at which point she can randomly ask to join your house on any day following this. Alternatively, her recruit requirements lie in magic and bows and vary based on her support level with Byleth, with the C+ requirements being reachable in a pretty reasonable time frame, if you would prefer something more concrete to recruit her quickly, although the magic requirement can be a little bit of a gate, as Byleth doesn't really excel in this area. Mercedes' personal ability is Live to Serve, which causes any healing she does to her allies to also heal her for the same amount. This is a simple ability on paper, but quite a weird one to determine the use of. Mercedes is not a frontline unit, and typically shouldn't be somebody you are looking to have tank attacks, especially multiple times in a map. That being said, she can sometimes be the favoured target of things like ballistas and siege tomes, so this can make it an easy way to keep her in range of those, providing she can eat the turn's worth of hits, since as long as she heals one ally, she will top herself up too. Players who aren't familiar with the game's ambush spawns may also find use from this ability, since it feels like they can often come at any time from anywhere. Being able to keep Mercy topped up on HP without having to actually go out of your way to heal her can make her feel a lot more safe and secure to use, since she stands a better chance of surviving a hit from the stray enemy who decides to spawn behind her. This obviously falls away when you become more familiar with where and when these spawn, since you can just keep her out of range, but there can still be merit to letting her tank a hit, and Live to Serve can help with that. On the whole though, this is a pretty low impact ability, and it's unlikely to affect your play too much. If you use multiple healers, it could potentially even cost you healing opportunities with those other units, although you can play around this in a lot of scenarios by simply healing with them on Mercedes first, and even if you don't do this, it's a pretty small downside, only costing some XP and class mastery, which can be relevant but probably won't be. Mercy also comes with a minor crest of Lamine, giving her a 10% chance to conserve uses of recovery magic on every cast. This can hold some use, especially considering she gets a fair few healing spells, and whilst it can benefit the later ones if you find yourself using them frequently, its biggest benefit comes from giving her a potential extra cast of heal in the early game, which can be invaluable considering the reduced spellcasts of Noble and Commoner. The fact that she has a crest at all also means that she can use relics without taking damage. Although this is unlikely to provide too much of a benefit, there are a couple of relics she might want to make use of. She also gets some potential upsides from the Raphael gem and the Tathlon bow, which specifically link to the crest of Lamine, but once again, this is unlikely to play a role with her, and even if they did, these benefits are basically negligible. Moving on to Mercy's skill spread, she brings 2 boons in the magical areas of Reason and Faith, a massive 4 banes in swords, lances, axes, and heavy armor, and a budding talent in bows. From this it should go without saying that Mercy is a magically oriented character, but even then there are several aspects of this that are super rough. The Faith boon seems like a good place to start. The actual boon is great for her and can make it much easier for her to reach valuable classes, so no complaints about that one. Where there are issues is with the starting rank of D. The designated healers of the other houses, Marianne and Linhardt, start with a D+ in this area, and it is a massive shame that Mercy doesn't get the same treatment, as it holds her back a lot more than you would expect. To explain why, we need to dive into Mercy's spell list. Every unit in the game gets the same 2 Faith spells first, Heal at D and Nosferatu at D+. While Mercedes still has access to heal at base, unlike the other 2 previously mentioned healers, she does not get access to Nosferatu. This is even more damaging when combined with the half spellcasts of Commoner and Noble, because it means that at base, if you choose to bring Mercy into Chapter 1, all she can really do is cast heal 5 times, which just isn't much. It also massively hinders the amount of EXP she can get, as she can't pick up chip damage and kills with Nosferatu without investing to get it. But whilst you can invest and get Nosferatu in time for Chapter 2, the problems here continue as the 2 previously mentioned units are now accessing Physic at this point. This again leads to less actions being possible, once again restricting her EXP gain and making it even harder for her to shred those half casts, which again restricts her growth more. Of course, Physic is also a very useful spell in its own right, allowing her to heal from a great distance, and access to this as early as possible can give you a much easier time through the early game. Now, Mercy does start with a boosted Reason rank, but unfortunately E+ is not enough to give her any spell access by default, and she will need to push it up to D to gain access to Fire. That being said, Fire is a very handy spell to get. Just because she doesn't get it from base, it doesn't mean it isn't appreciated, because it absolutely is. It's got solid accuracy, it's pretty light, and 10 casts at base means that even when halved you can still throw it around 5 times, which is quite nice. Weirdly, Mercy also gets a second base spell at D+ rank in Reason, this time getting Thunder. This hits a little harder, but is also less accurate and brings less cast than Fire. If it was a choice between the two, you would almost always opt for Fire, but having Thunder alongside it is definitely nice, especially getting 2 spells at such a low rank, because what Mercy really needs here is casts. It doesn't particularly matter what she is actually casting. We will continue down her Reason list, where Mercy gets Bolganon at the C rank. It's pretty par for the course as an option here, but there's nothing overly wrong with that. It's accurate enough, 8 might is fine, and it brings another 5 cast to the table, which can let her blow up some enemies. It's not outstanding, but it's not bad either. Mercy doesn't get anything else in Reason until she hits the A rank, where she gets Ragnarok, and with its 15 might it is by far her highest damage option, which is greatly appreciated for unlocking any offensive potential Mercy has. That being said, it still doesn't hit that hard, and you only get 3 casts of it in any given map, so it can still be a little lacking. Flicking back over to Faith, at the B rank, Mercedes gets Restore, a spell that nobody really values until you get Gambited, and then it becomes the best spell in the game for 1 turn only. This removes the status conditions from any allies within its quite large range, and it's always a handy one to have in the locker. Whilst you won't find a ton of situations where it's super useful, in those places where it can be used, you are extremely grateful to have it around. At the A rank, Mercedes gets access to Fortify, a spell which massively heals all allies in a range surrounding the caster. This is a weird spell, especially for something so simple, because of the mechanics of 3 houses. What messes this one up is that low health builds, particularly things like Wrath, Vantage, and Vengeance, are incredibly strong, and as the tag implies, the units who use these want to be on low health to activate or strengthen these abilities. This means that in a lot of cases, clicking Fortify can actually end up hindering some of your units, and in general it's just less ideal than using targeted heals since they can still easily avoid the units you don't want to hit. You can of course position around it, but then we go to the other problem of Fortify. It's just a big AoE heal. It's just not that good. Healing is pretty easy to come by in 3 houses, whilst also not being particularly in high demand, especially by the time you reach A Faith. There just aren't that many times you will need to heal a bunch of units at once, and this requires more setup than it initially seems to stop you from hitting low health builds. For an A rank spell, it would just be nicer to have something with more applications or benefits to it. Even after you get this, Physic is still her most ideal healing spell, and ironically Fortify would have been better earlier, where low health builds weren't in play yet, and face tanking is your main way of moving forward. Of course, everyone plays the game differently, and if you find yourself not utilising many low health builds and requiring a lot of healing, Fortify stocks can soar quite a lot, but in most situations that likely won't be particularly applicable, especially because of how accessible and strong these low health setups can be. That about wraps up Mercy's spells, but of course the 2 boons here also help with class qualifications throughout the game, and a lot of Mercy's best classes can be accessed a lot easier thanks to a pair of boons in Reason and Faith. Despite these not being as ideal as they could be, in general they are still solid for her. Now, let's take a look at the big pile of Banes that Mercy has. Whilst they are numerous, most of them are likely to be quite low impact. Lances don't really affect anything desirable at all, so this one isn't really problematic, and whilst axes and heavy armor can be useful for some certifications, these are mostly just optional stat pads and nothing that is going to drastically impact her performance, so these being there aren't too bad either. For these 3 you probably won't care too much about them. Swords is a bit of a different story, mainly because of access to the Levin Sword, which can be an extremely handy tool for any caster, but especially somebody like Mercedes, who lacks any 3 ranged spells within her kit, something which the Levin Sword Plus does bring to the table. It only requires C Swords, so it is entirely plausible to fight through the Bane to gain access to this, but obviously requiring more investment to access a tool like this is not particularly ideal. Even after you gain access to the Levin Sword, the Bane will slow down the rate at which you can gain access to valuable prowess skills to aid her accuracy when using it, so it's not like once you get this, the Bane stops being relevant. Overall, this one is just really annoying. It's a hindrance that Mercedes just didn't need, considering some of the other issues already outlined within her kit, and having to invest even more into Mercy to get access to a pretty basic tool is not ideal. The last thing to cover here is Mercy's budding talent in bows. If she masters this talent by being tutored in bows 12 times, it will turn into a boon and she will unlock the combat art Waning Shot, which provides a boost of 4 might, has 2 to 3 range, and inflicts a debuff of -5 strength to the opponent for 1 turn if they are hit by this. It doesn't hold a ton of use, but the 3 range and strength debuff might come in handy on occasion. What this boon can really help with is some classing options for Mercedes, giving her some interesting late game builds. It can also make it easier for her to access the magic bow, a tool which she can make excellent use of in the right class and with the right build. The magic bow can be awkward to acquire and maintain, especially early in the game before you have consistent access to arcane crystals, but it is still a tool worth keeping in mind. Mercedes' base stats are a little bit odd. Her magic of 10 is fine, but on the lower end for units who are pushed to focus on this, although it is still usually enough to get the job done. She's also not too bad on the speed front, with 8 base speed and 6 strength to offset a point of weapon weight. She won't be doubling much, but it can help her prevent doubles in a lot of cases, and since she can easily top her own HP back up with Live to Serve, using her to block an enemy in a pinch is actually pretty viable. That being said, she is not physically bulky. 25 HP and 5 defense is not letting her take more than 1 attack usually, although with 9 resistance, mages are easy for her to eat the hits from, and she will hold her own against these perfectly fine. Her other stat which is actually very solid is her 8 base charm, giving her pretty solid gambit reliability from the get-go, which is never going to be something to complain about. Overall, Mercy's stats are completely fine, nothing outstanding, but they have some strengths alongside their weaknesses. The last thing to note about Mercy is that she has a might support with her childhood friend, Annette. This can help out either unit if you plan on using them from a combat perspective, although it will most likely help if you use one of the two as an adjutant for the other. Mercy not having too much trouble reaching a flying class, only hindered by the lance boon, helps her a little here if you did want to pursue this. Let's move on to looking at using Mercedes from a gameplay perspective, and if you choose the Blue Lions, you could opt to take her into Chapter 1, but honestly, I wouldn't recommend it. Only having 5 uses of heal with no Nosferatu to help out just means her contributions on this chapter are extremely low. It might feel unnerving to go in without a healer, but the chapter is slow paced enough that you can keep yourself topped up with vulneraries for any healing that you require. If you did want to bring Mercy here, make sure to bring her a weapon so that she can at least provide supports via linked attacks. When looking at going into Chapter 2, I think the biggest temptation can be to push her Faith rank up, acquire Nosferatu, and get closer to Physic, even though the latter won't be reached in time. Whilst this does help Mercedes out, I think her better course of action here is instead to invest in her Reason, where you can pick up Fire as an alternative option. Its high accuracy can be very beneficial here. With that in mind, you can then use any remaining tutoring to push closer to Nosferatu, and by proxy get closer to Physic for Chapter 3, which will be the earliest Mercedes can get it either way. One of the things that really holds her back the most is that she struggles to reach level 5 quickly, to relieve herself of the burden of half spellcasts that her starter class has. This snowballs into slower growth for a while, and then she is left having to play catch-up. When she does finally hit the beginner class threshold, Monk is the obvious choice. It lets her keep her spell access whilst in the class, which is kind of the only contribution she really has at this point, and if you master it, you get access to the Magic +2 ability to amp up her damage. It also grants her the drawback combat art to reposition herself and an adjacent ally 1 tile, and since she doesn't have a massive pool of combat arts to pull from, this will likely have some use throughout the game. Whatever you choose to do with Mercedes, Mage will always be a strong option for an intermediate class. It once again continues to give her spell list access, as well as giving her a point of magic while she is in it. However, its biggest draw is Fiendish Blow, the ability gained from mastering the class. This grants a boost of 6 magic when the user initiates combat, and can massively amp up her damage, particularly in some builds, and in general just helps her out a lot. Mage requires C Reason, which is very easy to reach without any bother at all. After mastering Mage, you may want to go into Priest. As Mercedes already has access to the Fire spell, this ability in the Mage class doesn't do a whole lot for her other than doubling her casts, which will seldom see much use. Priest, on the other hand, gives a small boost to the amount of healing Mercedes gives out, so it can be one of the rare times where Priest holds an advantage, and if you do find her doing a lot of healing, increasing the amount that she heals might be desirable. Priest requires C Faith to guarantee the qualification, and again, this is very easily attained. As for her investment here, the most obvious things are to keep picking up her spells by investing into her Reason and Faith, to gain access to her highest damage options in the former and her utility in the latter. You will also want to keep her authority up so that she can use any relevant battalions. You can also look at mastering the bow budding talent if you feel this is something you will make use of in the future, which can be quite a valuable option, depending on what your endgame plans are for Mercedes, and these can wildly vary depending on what you want her to bring to your team. You don't really get much middle ground on Mercy, you either go all in on her offense or all in on her healing. I feel like the latter is the more obvious choice here, so let's go over that one first. After the intermediate stage, there isn't really a whole lot left that you will want to pick up. The last stage for healing Mercedes is to jump into Bishop at level 20. This requires a Faith, but with her boon, alongside the fact that she will likely be using a lot of healing magic in this role, this is very easy to achieve. Bishop provides a couple of things here which are very handy. White magic uses ×2 allows Mercy twice as many casts of all of her white magic spells, which can be very relevant with things like Physic and Fortify if you are using them frequently. When in Bishop, all of your healing is also increased by 10, which can be pretty valuable and allow you to keep your allies in top condition. The biggest drawback of Bishop is its highly limited movement, which can massively hinder Mercedes' mobility and make it difficult for her to keep up. However, at least her long-range heals can still let her do her job. From here, her actual in-game use is fairly obvious. She wants to prioritise healing over anything else, so if you do have allies who need a top-up on their HP bars, she should be your first port of call for that task. The problem here, this is all Mercy really brings to the table in this role. She doesn't have a ton of other contributions to a team. She can chip at things with her spells, but this won't be too effective, and again, her limited mobility can make it difficult for her to get in range to even have these small combat contributions. This can mean that on turns where you don't need any heals, Mercedes can find herself without much to do. Giving her useful gambit tools, such as Stride, Retribution, or Dance of the Goddess, can be one way to offset this, giving her other tasks to do when healing isn't required, although these are still limited and may not always be desirable, and once again the movement issues can cause problems with actually keeping up with her allies to use these effects on them, and most other classes that could alleviate this problem don't provide her with the double cast of her Faith spells. One that may be an option is to go into Gramarye at a master level, requiring a Reason and a Faith. This provides a vital extra point of move, however you do lose the boost to healing that Bishop provides, although this may be a trade-off worth making. It also gives her a boost of 5 magic as a class modifier, which may help her damage if you did want to throw out those Reason spells. Importantly, she does still keep the double use of white magic spells, and also gets double use of her black magic spells too, although the latter is unlikely to play too much of an impact. The big problem I have with Mercy when she is in this role is that it kind of pigeonholes her into performing as a dedicated healer, and personally I don't find this to be something which is particularly helpful in my playthroughs of the game. Healing is something which I find to be pretty low in demand and high in supply regardless, since a lot of other casters bring healing spells like Physic to the table, and as was mentioned before, a lot of builds just actively don't want healing anyway. However, that's just me. A lot of people have used Mercedes as a healer and found her to be a valuable or even vital member of their team. Your personal playstyle and the other builds you choose to run could turn Mercedes into an important asset here. That being said, if you wanted to use Mercy but find that, like me, a dedicated healer just isn't something your team is crying out for, do you have any other options? Well, yes. Yes you do. It's time to take a look at her path into Sniper. By making use of that budding talent in bows, Mercy can quickly climb the ranks to reach the A threshold that Sniper requires to guarantee promotion into it. Sniper is typically a physical class. However, by making use of one particular tool, Mercy can make use of her magic stat within it, and that is a magic bow. This can be forged to B+ Professor level from a steel bow using 2 arcane crystals, or alternatively you can buy it from the Pagan altar if you are choosing to use that. Now of course, the magic bow could be used in any class, but no other class brings the combat art Hunter's Volley, which is exclusive to Sniper and unlocked by mastering the class. This is a brave combat art, meaning it guarantees 2 attacks in succession, and can be used to punch through a ton of enemies and bring down foes that would otherwise be beyond Mercedes' capabilities. To further aid this, a lot of foes that may be able to tank these attacks due to their high resistance either have a bow weakness, such as Pegasus Knights, or are just physically frail, such as Mages, so a hit with a silver bow may still be able to bring them down despite Mercy's unimpressive strength, which will likely be operating off of Sniper's base plus modifier of 18. Most enemies are much more stacked in defense though, and as a result, the magic bow combined with Hunter's Volley can cause havoc as a player phase tool. Fiendish Blow still applies here, boosting its damage by 6, and Mercy's magic stack can certainly get the job done here despite not being anything too special in its own right. If you did opt for this, picking up an accuracy ability such as Hit plus 20 or Uncanny Blow can be very helpful. Either of these are valid. If your aim was to go with this from the get-go and you don't need Mercedes as a healer during the period of time where she's in an intermediate class, going Archer for hit plus 20 is probably the ideal choice. You can use her as a unit to master this, but honestly it's probably a lot easier to attach her to a unit who sees a lot of combat as an adjutant, where she will likely have finished this within a few maps, potentially faster if you're happy to commit the knowledge gem to her, although this will likely be more useful on the battlefield. Uncanny Blow, which grants 30 hit when the unit initiates combat, is acquired from mastering Valkyrie. This requires B Reason and B Riding to certify into, which isn't too unreasonable, but the big issue is that this is an advanced class, and thus the time when you are in this directly clashes with the time when you could be in Sniper, whereas Archer only competes with her pre-20 classes. That being said, it's not like Valkyrie is a horrible class for Mercy to be in. She will have full spell access, allowing her to perform her usual healing duties, plus the class grants her 6 move and Canto, making her very mobile. On top of this, her Reason spells will have their range boosted by 1, and the class's inherent +4 magic modifier will amp up her damage pretty significantly. I personally prefer the Archer option to let her jump straight into Sniper, but there's nothing wrong with going for Uncanny Blow instead, and her healing spell access will let her take an action every turn, and her being on map makes it much easier to let her see use of the Knowledge Gem rather than as an Archer Adjutant. Once you have your accuracy ability, you are basically done here. You just need to head back into Sniper and click Hunter's Volley on anything that you want dead, and Mercedes will be a valuable player phase combat unit for you. You will want to make sure you access the Dart Merchant as early as possible in Part 2, so that you can get a sustainable amount of Arcane Crystals to keep her bow repaired, although you can also get these from feeding cats and dogs around the monastery, among other places. All in all, I much prefer this application of Mercedes, where her player phase combat can be a valuable asset for you. I think this about wraps up Mercedes. I hope this helps you to get the most out of her. If you're interested in discussing this video, my channel, or Fire Emblem in general, consider joining the Discord. Before we finish, I would like to thank everyone who backs the channel on Patreon, where for just £1 a month you can support me in making content like this and everything else on the channel, as well as getting benefits for yourself too. For more information, check the link in the description. Finally, I would like to thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and have a great day!